So we're going through a series now on finding purpose in the 6 stages of life, and we've looked so far at the amazing work of God in the womb. And last week we looked at the wonder of childhood and celebrating them and educating them and emulating them. Today we're going to talk about teenagers. As I talk about this, I'm reminded of our time in New York. I was a pastor in Western New York, Buffalo, Niagara Falls area for about 12 years. One of the things we love to do is go boating in the area. And I'm reminded of this section of Buffalo, the Peace Bridge. And the Peace Bridge connected Buffalo, New York to Ontario, Canada. But if you looked underneath the Peace Bridge, it was anything but peaceful. All the waters of Lake Erie funneled down into the Niagara River. And if it looks that choppy and rough from the air, imagine what it looked like on it in a boat. I remember taking our little 17-foot aluminum boat with a 40-horse Mercury on it up that for the first time. And I'm telling you, the current was so strong. The waves were like whitewater rafting. There'd be whirlpools where it would just start shifting the boat and even pulling it down a little bit. And you had to be careful by the cement structures underneath the bridge where the water was just pounding around them that it didn't suck your boat up into it and pin it or roll it against it. Talk about having a lot of faith in that little motor going up. And you know, if our word last week for children was growth, as I think about the teenage years, the word I would pin to it is transition. And teenagers, that's what you are doing now. You are navigating those transitional waters between childhood and adulthood. And it can be like running a gauntlet. That's what the locals called this section of the Niagara Falls River, the gauntlet. In youth today, it is like you are swimming up current against those very waters. There are physical changes still going on in your body. There are social changes. And culturally, there are changes. This is not even the country I grew up in 20 years ago as a teenager. In fact, youth, if you are a Bible-believing Christian today, not only are there pockets that would call you intolerant, but even hateful. And the current is so strong that you are up against from your childhood to adulthood that if you want to keep the faith, studies show 6 in 10 of you are going to fall away in just the next 5 years. The current is that strong in our culture today that you will stop going to worship, you will stop going to the Lord's Supper, you will stop prayer life, you will stop being in Scripture, and 6 in 10 of you will be just washed down current with culture. I was just talking to a parent last week whose child goes to a university that has a Christian name. And at this school, the professor of religion was an atheist. And every chance the professor had, he just berated the Bible and he berated Christians. And by the end of the semester, several of the students were swayed into his ideology. And they were also part of those 6 in 10 who were swept down current. So youth, if you want to come into adulthood with the faith that God has given you now, you are going to have to be bold. But the good news is that in the Scripture today, David tells you, all of us, how we can not only get to adulthood with faith, but even a stronger faith. So let's look at these words today in 1 Samuel 17. How many of you have ever heard the story of David and Goliath? Yes, I think it's even a veggie tale. But before we get into it, there's two contexts I just want to point you to. The first is a really big verse in the chapter before David and Goliath. Look on the top of your notes at chapter 16. The prophet Samuel is sent to anoint a new king for Israel to Jesse's home in Bethlehem. And Samuel sees his oldest son, who must just be a stud. Because Samuel looks at him and says, that's got to be our next king. Look at what God says to him on your notes. God says, don't look on his appearance or on Eliab's stature, for man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Keep that in mind as we go through this story of David and Goliath. Secondly, we need to talk about the valley of Elah. The Philistines were from over here on the coast. That's where Goliath is from, of Gath. They have come into the promised land just about 8 miles west of Bethlehem to this valley, and they have set up their military on this side. So naturally, King Saul and the Israelites set up their military on this side of the valley. And as both of those armies are facing each other, Goliath steps forward. And the text notes his stature. He was over 9 feet tall. His armor is state of the art. He has a bronze helmet, bronze covering on his legs. The metal coat weighs 126 pounds that he has on. He also has really good weaponry. He has a sword, he has a javelin, he has a spear with a 15-pound head on it. And he has an armor bearer who carries a shield in front of him. But the biggest thing on Goliath is his giant mouth, where every day, morning and evening, Goliath steps forward out of the battle line and starts defying and slandering and taunting God's people. And how do you think the Israelites responded? Look underneath in verse 11. Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and greatly afraid. What really separated the two armies was not the valley of Elah, but it was a chasm of fear. Where were the Israelites and their king focused? On the outward appearance. Because that's often where man looks. Look at his height, look at his armor, look at his weaponry, look at his armor bearer, listen to his mouth. We can't do this. Until one morning, when Goliath was taunting the Israelites as usual, a young shepherd was sent to the front line to check on his 3 oldest brothers. And Goliath opened his mouth one too many times. Young David heard his slander. And these are King David's first ever words in the Bible. He hears it and he says to the men who are around him, "What will be done to the man who smites this Philistine and turns away his slander from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should slander the battle lines of the living God?" Whatever we are facing, David just gave us all the starting point. Finally, after 26 verses in this battle scene, he interjects God. Do you think that God is an important one to bring in to this scenario? Goes, are you just going to let this uncircumcised goon step forward and slander the people of God, whom God has put his name on? What about us? With whatever trials we face, if the people around us could read our minds or hear our thoughts, what would they hear in us? would they hear a bold faith in the living God? Whatever we are facing, or if they read our minds and thoughts, would they hear loads of doubt or fear or worry or maybe even hopelessness and despair? Well, word gets back to King Saul about what David said, and the king himself summons David into his presence. And look at what David says to the king. David says on the bottom of your notes, "Let not the heart of man fall on account of Goliath. Your servant will go and engage in battle with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You aren't able to go to this Philistine and engage in battle with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of battle from his youth." See, if to be in the Israelite military, you had to be 20 years old or older, and David is not on the line with his 3 oldest brothers. How old is David? He's not 20 yet. He's a teenager, maybe even a young one. And so Saul looks at him. It's like, "David, you're missing the obvious. Look at yourself. You're a youth. And look at Goliath. He's been a warrior since he was a youth. That's as stupid as Captain America going against Thanos on his own. And a Thanos with all 6 Infinity Stones. It's just madness, David." But here's the point. In God's hands, age doesn't matter. Youth, your age is irrelevant when you are in the hands of the living God. This truth is in both testaments of the Bible. God told Jeremiah in chapter 1, "Hey, before I even formed you in your mama's stomach, I appointed you, Jeremiah, that you would go be my prophet to the nations." And Jeremiah said, "God, I don't know how to speak, for I am only a youth." He played the youth card. "I'm young and dumb, God, sorry." What did God say back to Jeremiah? "Don't you say I am only a youth, for I am with you to deliver you." Jeremiah, in my hands, your age does not matter. And in the New Testament, Paul says the same thing to young Timothy. "Timothy, don't you let people despise you because you are a young pastor. In fact, as a young Christian, you can even set an example for all of the adult Christians by how you talk and live and your purity and faith and your love. Because in God's hands, age does not matter." And so what would David say to that? To a king who just looked at him and said, "You are way too small, kid." Turn over and look at David's response. David said back to King Saul, "Your servant was shepherding his father's flock, and the lion came, and the bear came, and it took a sheep from the flock. But I went after it, and I struck it, and I delivered the sheep from its mouth. And when it rose up against me, I was strong with its beard, and I struck it and killed it. Even the lion, even the bear your servant has smitten, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has slandered the battle lines of the living God." Really big truth there. Whom God chooses, God equips. Whom God chooses, God equips. And sometimes this is how God does it. God used David's previous experiences, especially his hardships, facing a lion, facing a bear, to do what? To prepare him for this moment in time. While David probably thought it was just a day shepherding, and a lion came at the flock, and David took down that lion with his hands. God knew it was preparing him for something different. And then when a bear came and did the same exact thing, David probably thought it was just another day shepherding. But you see, God used both of those experiences, the lion and the bear, because God knew it would prepare David for this moment to take on an undefeated giant. Youth, that's how God continues to work. You might be facing something really hard or difficult in your life right now, but you don't know the big picture of God's plan and how God might be using that hardship in your life right now to prepare you for something that is coming down the road. Because whom God chooses, God equips. And it's here that God chose you and put his holy name on you. And whatever he has for you in his plan, he will prepare you for that moment. So in that valley, while King Saul and all of the Israelites could only see an untouchable Philistine, we can't do it. Look at his armor. Look at his height. Look at his weaponry. Listen to his mouth. We're dead. What did David see? He saw a blasphemous, uncircumcised man. And if Goliath was uncircumcised, that meant that he was not in a covenant relationship with the living God, and he had no business being in the land. I love how the Bible's connected. What did God say in Leviticus was the punishment for blaspheming his name? Leviticus 24, God said, whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall be put to death. The whole congregation shall stone him. When he engages Goliath, we'll get to that. What weapon does David choose? The sling and a stone, because he has just been blaspheming the name of the Lord. He must die by stone. Verse 37 is the climax. David still says to the king, the Lord who delivered me from the hand of the lion and from the hand of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Looking back in faith emboldens us to look forward in faith. Listen to David's answer. The same Lord who delivered me from the hand of the lion, who delivered me from the hand of the bear, that's the past. He is the exact same God who will deliver me from this Philistine. It's the same God. What if you looked in your rearview mirror? What would you see? What victories would you already see in your life that you are still sitting here today that God has worked through? So that whatever you are facing now, as you look in the front windshield of your life, you can go boldly because it's the exact same God who was working in your life back then. We look back in faith to look forward in boldness. Our God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. See, David knew that he was not going to be delivered because he had true grit, but because he knew the true God. Wasn't his grit, he knew the true God. David knew it wasn't his skill, it wasn't his experience with the lion and the bear, it wasn't his prowess, but it was only because of the God who was with him that victory would be his. And so as Goliath approached him, we're told Goliath walked. And David started to run. And David crossed that creek, the wadey at the bottom, and David picked up stones. They were about the size of a baseball. And we know that skilled shepherds could sling a stone at 100 to 150 miles an hour. So imagine a baseball-sized stone going 150 miles an hour, and David at a distance let it rip. And we're told that it went and hit Goliath and broke his cranium bone and sank right into his head. And he went tumbling down. Friends, here we are 3,000 years later, and our circumstances will vary. We probably won't go hand to hand with a lion. We probably won't go hand to hand with a bear. And it's really unlikely that we'll go hand to hand with a Philistine giant. Though our circumstances vary, the real God does not. And so whether we are facing a flock with predators, whether we are going against a Philistine, or whether you are facing whatever you write on that next blank, maybe it's something at school, something going on with classmates, something in your family, some kind of health, you've gone through an extreme loss, whatever you write on that next line, whatever you are facing, who is the real God? He is Yahweh. And he is the living God. And while you might be tempted to look at your outward appearances, this God looks at the heart. And he always delivers his people. And the God who delivered David and the Israelites that day, the God who broke out of his own tomb on Easter morning, is the same God who will deliver you whatever you are facing. As he was with David, as he was with his own son, youth, as you continue to transition through those waters into adulthood, this God is always with you. And next week, we will look at that next stage of life, that stage of adulthood. Hey, let's close with his name and blessing on us. This is the same name and blessing that God put on the Israelites 3,500 years ago. The same name and power that we go in today. Would you please stand? As you go, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with favor and fill you with his peace. Amen.